Great.
Yeah.
Well, I think we'll get going. So thanks everyone for coming along. My name is James Tout. I work with Henrietta in the Institute for Global Prosperity on Communications. And I'll just do a very quick introduction. So Henrietta Moore, Director of the Institute for Global Prosperity. We've got Andrew Percy, who's the citizen sponsor of the IGP's Social Prosperity Network. Professor Jonathan Portis from King's College. And Howard Reed from Lambton Economics. And we're just going to give a short presentation on some of the key findings in the report, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, and obviously feel free to ask questions of whoever you want to. So I'll hand over to Henrietta.
Yes. Well, I think we're going to do this little this video first, just for those of you who didn't see it the first time.
Who's starting?
The UK is wealthy, but for many people it's not prosperous. Our economy is failing to deliver for so many people. Forces of resentment and anger have entered our politics as a growing number of people are left behind. We have record numbers of people in poverty, and over 4 million people regularly go a day without eating. How can we think more intelligently about how we can make sure our economy makes people prosperous in a way we can afford? Our research presented in this paper demonstrates unequivocally that money spent on providing basic services, the most fundamental building blocks for life required by every citizen in the 21st century, dramatically reduces the cost of basic living for those on the lowest incomes. Even if income levels remain static, it will make accessible a life that includes participation, builds belonging and common purpose, and potentially strengthens the cohesion of society as a whole.
Unskilled wages have stagnated for many people in developed countries. And then going forward, automation and technology are likely to change the way all of us work. And there are some pretty big risks here. In particular, there are risks that people at the lower end of the labour market either see their jobs disappear or find that they become increasingly insecure in their forms of employment and that their wages continue to stagnate. So one idea that's been talked about a lot recently is universal basic income, the concept of a basic or citizen's income that would be paid to everybody, irrespective of whether they had a job or not. But we want to take that in a rather different direction. So we've been looking at something which we call universal basic services. So what would that mean in practice? So, for example, we've been looking at the idea of providing free transport for everybody. We've been looking at whether we could provide free communication services, mobile phones, access to broadband for everybody. Providing these services free at the point of use to all members of society would help us communicate better with each other, would help people participate more fully, would help people not only be able to get jobs and keep jobs, but have greater choice about how they participate in society, greater choice about how they function in the labour market, and would make us all better off.
One of the funny things is that we have the NHS, and we have no problem understanding that for healthcare, of course it should be a service. We don't send people money so that they can buy private health insurance, and yet we have some difficulty bringing that idea over to the other side. What we're proposing is that that is exactly the idea that we can use in different parts of our society and really have an effect on poverty and life chances for people across our society. There you go, so sorry for those of you that already watched that online, but maybe didn't see it.
Yeah, so as James said, I'm Henrietta Moore, and I'm really pleased that you're all here this morning, and thank you very much for coming. So the basic work that we've been doing on universal basic services in the IGP just starts from the very simple premise that we all recognise, which is that since the crisis of 2008, there's been a serious lack of ideas about how we can get things back on track and how we can get the economy delivering again. Suggestions that have been put forward have been basically extremely tame, and we've done very little to reverse this trend. In the UK, we're coming towards the end of a lost decade for wages, as real income has fallen by about 10.4% between 2007 and 2015. And it continues to fall now, which leaves us with a really big problem, which is that work is no longer a way out of poverty. to do about that. We're used to hearing about how employment levels are at a record high, but of course, as you all know, is in work poverty. And the number of children living in poverty in the UK is around 4 million, and it's projected to rise to about 5 million by 2020. And we're looking around really to see who's proposing something sensible to address these issues. So I think what we want to do here is to set a bit of a context for how we can begin to get people flourishing again, begin to focus on what the economy should be focused on, which is improving people's quality of life. Clearly, it's wrong for us to expect that the same ideas that worked yesterday will work today and continue to work tomorrow, but that does seem to be roughly what we've been doing. An economic approach defined by chasing GDP growth has created soaring standards of living for some people. But now a continued failure to think beyond that, even with the new post-growth models that we've all become familiar with in the last couple of years, is beginning to cost us very dear socially, economically and politically. So the Institute for Global Prosperity, or the IGP as we always call it, was established to develop innovative solutions to some of the world's most pressing challenges and to find new ways for universities to apply their expertise to improving the quality of life for people across the globe. So at the IGP, we are interested in three things: public debate around new ideas, sustainable investment in social infrastructures, and public policy aimed at improving the quality of people's lives. If we can't provide people with a chance to flourish and prosper, the very cohesion of society is at risk, as we all recognise. And for this reason, we've been working on this UBS proposition, which we're putting before you today, and we are launching a report. It's our hope that what will happen as a result of this launch is that we will generate a discussion about some new ideas that could deliver new ways forward. So to take you through the detail of this and the important research that lies behind it, I'm going to turn over to Jonathan.
Thanks, What I'm going to talk about, I think, is sort of the rationale and motivation for this sort of approach. I mean, I think, the central problem of the last 20 years or so in Western democracies, in particularly the UK and US, has been widening income inequality, or widening earnings inequality driven by technological change. We sought to address that through redistributing income through the tax and benefit system as best we could, and it had some modest success. We did see child poverty fall in the 2000s, but I think the financial crisis showed that approach, and its aftermath shows that approach has sort of run out of road. It was no longer politically or economically sustainable simply to address what the market was doing through those redistributions, and we've seen that redistribution roll back considerably over the last few years, and that will happen even more over the next few years under the plans of the current government, even more so in the US, of course. As Henrietta said, at the same time we've had this extremely high levels of unemployment, but stagnating real wages, and wages at the bottom really only kept up by the minimum wage, which again may be taking rather more, being asked to take rather more weight than it can usefully bear. And looking forward, what's going to happen? We see large number. There is a huge body of literature out there which suggests that large numbers of jobs are going to be, particularly low and medium skilled jobs, are going to be susceptible to automation. At the same time, of course, what we have seen is that automation so far has not destroyed jobs net. Employment is at a record high. There is no evidence as yet that the robots are coming to take all our jobs. What we have seen, as I said, is their growth in insecure and low-paid employment. So where do we go from here? Well, the answer is we don't know. Is it that robots are going to take our jobs, but they just haven't got around to it yet? So take Uber, for example. Uber has created tens of thousands of jobs, not very good jobs, but it's created a lot of jobs. But if Uber moves on to driverless cars, maybe those jobs will go for good, and similarly for trucks, and similarly for lots of. Or it may be I think so. One possibility is that we will actually begin to see these genuine job destroyed. Perhaps more likely, in my view, is that actually what we'll see is that jobs for many of us become even more insecure. That is, that people, yes, cars will become driverless, and people who currently drive for Uber or drive trucks will lose jobs, but they'll find other jobs, which will be equally, if not more, insecure, or underpaid, or in other way, or dead end in the sense of not offering any prospect for employment. So how do we get out of this? My view, as I said, is that the sort of thing which Howard and I spent quite a long time working on the today, we're trying to ameliorate this through the tax and benefit system, has limit. It's not, you can't not do it, and rolling it back as the current government has done is clearly makes things worse. You can't rely on that on its own by any means. And I think my concern with universal basic income type approaches is really universal basic income type approaches are really not conceptually that different in many ways from that approach. You're still saying that you're going to try and address inequality, but by redistribution through the tax and benefit system, and that both economically and politically, the sustainability of that is very questionable. So I think an approach that looks at it from the other way around, that looks at it, what is it that we want to provide as a society, what is it that we think is sort of essential to people, for people to be able to participate in our society in a meaningful way, coming in from that way rather than the money end, offers something which is both economically and politically more sustainable, and we really do, as Henrietta said, we really do very badly need this sort of idea. And I think what I and Howard have tried to do here is to put some flesh on the bones of this, both in policy terms and from a quantitative and economic perspective. And we're certainly not claiming that we have all the answers here, or this is sort of a fully worked out proposal, but showing that this sort of idea has both theoretical and practical attractions. It is not crazy. It is not pie in the sky. The numbers can be made to add up. We hope that's our contribution.
Thanks, gentlemen. They call me the citizen sponsor here. What that means is I'm the non-academic on the panel, because Henrietta thinks these things work better when there's a mix of people. I'm really a small business person, and about 30 years ago I was involved in a very small, not very successful small business in West London, making the first British hip-hop album. And we worked with a lot of young people, some of whom were homeless. And that was an experience that gave me an insight into a welfare system that's not working, and also the social separation that happens when your welfare system isn't working. And that's led me on a journey of 30 years on and off looking at welfare reform. And what my role this morning to do is give you an introduction to how we've approached this in the report that's in front of you. And our starting point is to look at what are the set of needs that any individual in a modern society and economy needs to function well on a high level. So this is beyond food and shelter and healthcare and education, but also access to transport and being connected in a digital world. And we live in a democracy, and so there's a certain amount of legal infrastructure. We've distilled that into 7 services. And if you look at those, in the UK, we already provide 3 of those as services. So we have the healthcare system, we have the education system, and we have legal aid. And you can comment on how well we've done those, or what else needs to change in those environments. But what we've done in this report is take the other 4 and try and make them concrete, to actually look at them and say, well, what would that look like as a service? Because in doing that, we're then able to say, to answer 2 parts to then follow-up questions, which is what is the impact of those on people across the spectrum, and also what's the cost. So one of the sort of early questions that we get when we talk about this proposal to people. There are a number of advantages, and maybe we can talk about these afterwards. Certainly a lot of them are called out in the report, about delivering these as services rather than as a cash distribution. what I would want to point out of all of these at this time is that the way services work is that they replace cost for people. So effectively, you are enabling a higher level of retained pay within an individual pay packet if you've replaced some of those costs. And this preserves the motivation factor where politics is full of people saying, yeah, we want to preserve the value of work, it's always got to be better to go get a job, all of that. Services don't interrupt in that. And in fact, make work pay even more so. This is a chart that I pulled from the report that looks at the actual impact of these different services for people in different sectors of the income scale. So down at the D1s, that's our lowest 10% of income in the country, the impact can be very dramatic. It could be the equivalent to an 80% pay rise for people, or worth £3 an hour for someone who's on who's working full time. So the impact's very progressive, and for people who actually use these services, it can be very, very meaningful. And so we can maybe talk about what that then means for people who participate in these services. But I think that's one of the big things that comes out of this report. And the other thing that we've done is that we need to address what this question that everybody typically has, well, what's that going to cost? Surely, when you hear about free bus passes for everybody, or basic cell phone and internet services, a house building program, a community food program, people start to imagine that this must be a massive, unaffordable thing. So by making these quite concrete and describing them, what we've been able to do in this report is go through and cost those, and then look at that against the current UK budget. And so what you'll see here, don't worry too much about all of the detail, what I wanted to point out is that the yellow slices are the additional expense that we have put in this report for each one of the universal basic services that we're proposing to add. And you'll see that the blue slices are what we already spend on universal services in this country, one form or another: education, housing, healthcare. The yellow bits are what the additional cost of delivering everything that we have put in this report. So, I think what we hope you'll see from this is that we can, have a very transformative effect. And it's very progressive because services go naturally to users of services. And that the cost is within reach. And not to take away from the fact that there is cost here, and we've made it revenue neutral in our report by using the personal allowance as a way of paying for that. But there is nevertheless a 2.3% increase in GDP in both expense and revenue. But it's not unachievable. It's within reach, I would think we would. So that's as much as I was going to cover in these slides, and of course we'll open this up to questions afterwards. But I think Howard wants to say a little bit because he's involved a lot in the basic income and basic services.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, I just wanted to say just a couple of observations, really, comparing universal basic income with universal basic services, because I've been kind of appearing for both teams on the field as well. I've been involved in quite a lot of research, particularly for people like JRF, and we've got forthcoming research funded by Friends Provident Foundation, looking at distributional impact of universal basic income and how you might fund it. And also I've been involved in this research on UBS. My initial interest in universal basic income stems really from the idea that it's got a lot sort of intuitively to recommend it in terms of being a universal payment which gets you away from some of the issues with the current means tested social security system. I mean, currently, mainly due to overzealous means testing and conditionality, the system is full of holes. We've got a lot of people who are being sanctioned, who are being made homeless, who are having to go to food banks. Universal credit is accelerating that process, and it's a pretty horrific picture on a humanitarian scale. Faced with that current reality, the idea of a payment sufficient to reach a kind of minimum standard of living for all individuals or all households has a lot intuitively to recommend it. The problem, as we've seen with some of the research that I've been involved in, as well as other research from people like University of Bath and others, is that it's quite expensive. If you want to pay if you want to pay a universal basic income level that reaches a kind of the poverty line or a minimum income standard, it's very expensive. Even paying, say, the job seekers allowance level, which isn't very generous, about £75 a week to all individuals, costs about 250 billion pounds. You can reduce that a bit by cutting out some of the existing parts of the social security system, but it's quite hard to do that without creating a lot of losers. And research I did with Stuart Lansley did show that you can come up with a system that's just about revenue neutral, and it works, but it requires a big income tax and national insurance increases to get there, and it's quite a long way from where the tax and benefit system is at the moment to do that. With UBS, we've been looking at food, shelter, information and transport. There is a gross cost, but it's nowhere near as high as the variance of universal basic income that we've modelled. Partly because we've assumed that the food and shelter components in particular are actually pretty well targeted. They're universal because they're available to anybody, but we've assumed the people taking them up will be low income families essentially. And that means that the distribution is quite well targeted, and the gross cost is relatively small. Obviously, if these things were introduced and then there was more take-up for them, the gross cost would increase a little bit. So I think this is a really exciting area, and all credit to Andrew and Henrietta for kind of getting interested in this area and helping move it forward. I hope the report is valuable in terms of putting some technical detail and numbers on how this might be implemented. It's a long way from being the final word on this, and it may be that future variants of universal basic services or some combination of UBS and UBI may be what people look at in the future. But I think this is a really valuable contribution to the debate, and hopefully it's thought-provoking. So thanks.
Can I'll add something onto the end of that because it's in the report. So we're conscious of the debate that is out in the public about basic income. And so what we've done, and we're trying to do at each stage in various of the proposals for different services, is also call out what that same money would be if it was spent on a basic income. So you can look at, okay, well, we could give everybody a free bus pass, or we could give them this much money in basic income. And it allows you to look service by service comparatively and to look for yourself at what you think the relative values of those are. We've gone also a stage further than that in the last technical analysis, because in the end, not every expense that anybody has in our society can be delivered as a service. There are personal items that will probably require some cash component. And we have then included a very small basic income modelled in this. So it's £20 a week. It's lower than what anyone else is proposing. What's interesting about that is you can get all of the basic services, and the £20 a week, the net budget costs about the same. So it gives you a kind of direct comparison of how you can spend money and then where that money is going. So it's all in the report, and I just thought I'd point that out at the beginning. We're alive to the notion that basic income is out there, and it's, this is the start of the conversation.
Yeah, great. So let's take some questions. We're going to have a conversation. Yeah, please.
Ian Goff, NSE. I think this is a terrific proposal. It's one of those things I thought when I read it, because I have read it, why didn't anyone think of this before? It's revolutionary. And I like the way it relates to basic needs, and we can talk about what they are, and how they can be met. There are other benefits from it too, which you don't mention. Well, there's one key one, which is the environmental benefit. Done some work on their health services, the NHS comparing with the US health system, and the emissions from health in this country are much lower than the privatised American system. So that's another benefit you might want to mention. On this, what you propose, I think I would add to this some regulation on pricing, because there's two key elements here, basic needs, which aren't in the report, which is water and energy, domestic energy. And the notion of providing water for free or energy for free is obviously very costly. But you can have social pricing of these goods, so that the pricing per unit starts off low and goes up. So it's not a bit of the armoury in delivering services and redistributing services.
Yeah, thanks for both of those, Ian. There's quite a lot of sort of side things that can come up on the environmental side, which are somewhat more difficult than we want to be able to, that allowed us to include them in the report. But there are plenty, and that's a good one that services these sort of public.
There is a utilities allowance
And
included in the model, right, for things like electricity, gas, and I think water. So that is
Yes.
actually, it's a bit buried in there, but it is actually in there.
we put it in that
Under the
allocation.
housing.
Yeah. But you're right, because another aspect of this is, the alternative being this sort of cash distribution benefit system. As the JRF has pointed out, there's a poverty premium that people at the low end of the scale end up paying to buy the same things that you and I buy. It costs an extra 500 quid a year. So there, there's a saving conceivably there, but certainly better than. So thanks for both of
Yeah, okay. I mean, I agree with Ian that this looks really original and potentially very significant in terms of its benefits. I haven't had time to read the report, I'm afraid, so maybe everything is in the report, but can I just try and understand? So what you're saying is that at a cost of 2% of GDP, you could provide a guaranteed minimum in these 4 areas, that's shelter, food, transport and information. I can see how that works in the case of transport. So everybody gets a free bus pass, a free train pass, and so everybody gets free transport, whatever.
No, actually, it's just local transport.
It's just local transport. So, and you've worked out the cost of giving that
Yes.
Across the country. How does it work with shelter then? I mean, what are you giving people a guarantee? Are you giving everybody a voucher? Or how does it work?
I can answer. So what we've done fairly simply is we've modelled adding another 1.5 million social housing units and delivering those rent-free, utility-free, council tax-free.
Oh, so this is a capital cost. This is the cost of
We took a
over
cost
20
plus,
years providing.
plus there's a revenue cost in the loss of council tax revenues that have to be replaced, utilities
Right.
and those kinds of things.
And in the case of food, how does that work?
Foods is a very interesting one. We looked at 3 different options here. One is the straight replacement of food bank use. The other is a food program that would meet, so the Food Standards Authority does these biannual surveys and they come back with how many people have reported in the last year having difficulty putting food on the table for their family. That works out at about 4 million people. So we modeled something that said, took JRF MIS costs and said if we provided a third of the meals for the 8% of the population that has food insecurity, what would that cost and what would it look like? That implementation would have to be very local, and we call that in the report the implications of that. So that's how we did that.
The food, just because there's an element of means testing, it's not universal.
Well, universal access, but not, but we assume not universal take-up. And I think this is the key point to get at, I mean, we have universal access now to food bank. I can walk into a food bank, right? I mean, I go past the soup kitchen in King's Cross twice a week when I go home. If I went and asked for food, they would give me food, but I don't. And the assumption here is the same. The assumption here is really that we make a decent quality, nutritious food available to everybody, but that only those people who are genuinely food insecure take it up, which is quite a big number. I mean, we're talking about close to 100, it's more than 100 times as many meals as Brussels Trust currently provides. So we are not assuming that we're assuming significant take-up because there is a significant level of food insecurity in the population. But equally, we're not assuming, frankly, that anyone in this room takes it up. So the targeting is by is a universally opening out free food. Not obvious that most people do take it up. People need to take it up. So that's sort of one of the reasons why you end up even with universal service. get better targeting in practice. And admittedly, I mean, Howard had to make some fairly stylized assumptions, but it's, I think you can see with me that you would actually find that provision of basic food services was pretty low.
And on information, is that free internet, or how does that work?
It's broadband and mobile phone. Yeah.
So everybody gets that.
Yeah. So I think we've assumed full take up on that.
We have
Yeah.
on that one. We
Yeah.
assumed.
Again,
And I
I
think
think
what
might
you
get
say-
less than 100% take up because somebody might, say, I won't be kind of snazzy.
I mean, presumably what you say is that everybody, as commission of your license, you have to offer a basic plan.
Yeah.
You at a regulated price, which would be enough to, and everybody would get that, and then those of us who wanted whatever it is,
10 gigabytes a day.
10
Yeah.
gigabytes a day,
Yeah.
would you'd have to pay extra if you wanted to be live streaming or.
But if you
live
then
stuff.
defaulted on that bill, the underlying basic service would be uncancelable. So you never get disconnected. You can always call for the next job. You can get to the doctor. You can call the doctor.
So here and there, and
Yes.
I'm Jane Express, Director of the Public Services International Research Unit. I think this is a really important report. I think I'm interested partly in why you call it basic services rather than public. But I think the other question, which I think you've just mentioned briefly, is the issue of participation and involvement of service users in these services, because in a way one of the key questions facing public services in the future is how do you get that democratic element into them, which they often lack. And I think this, in a way, the success of this model would depend on addressing that.
I think you're absolutely right, and we've put, we recognise that there's one of the sort of linkages that exist here is exactly that some of this has to be done much more locally, with much more user input into design and delivery. And so we've mentioned it in here. We've costed something to do with an upgrade in local government, and I think you're absolutely right. That's going to be the key. You can't really imagine a sort of expanded food service without the concept of that. I mean, it's going to be enormously different than it is in a village in Devon than it is going to be here in Westminster.
yeah, and also the trend towards devolution of something is very important in the UK. It's massive. The election of mayors and so on. So there are movements there anyway, which can underpin.
Great. I mean, I wish I'd thought of this way of describing what I've been trying to do at the New Economics Foundation, which is to say that what we used to call the social wage, which is what this is really about, is far more important and more kind of sensible to develop than the idea of UBI, which I think Howard well knows, I think is really a dead end. So well done, and this is fantastic and very, very useful indeed. And I agree with you about the idea of who is in control of this. Is this a kind of a top-down model where government says everybody's got to have the following things and then is left to localities to work out how to do it, in which case we have to worry about equity, do we not? And what would be the mechanisms for that? I mean, I don't think you should be expected to solve these problems, by the way, because other people can engage in debate and think about how to think that through with you building on your work. But I just think that's a really important point. And I also wondered about whether you had, because I'm afraid I haven't read the whole report yet, whether you thought about the impact on jobs. Because yes, you're right, there would have to be a massive kind of voluntaristic contribution to this in various ways at various times, and the NHS is interestingly starting now to think much more in those terms than it ever did before, because it can't afford to go on doing what it's doing now. So if you have a big sort of armies of volunteers, perhaps, helping to provide the food, and but then when you come to constructing these new homes, you'd be having presumably good jobs. Then what's the effect on the economy? Is it factored into your pluses and minuses on what the effect would be? Where would the jobs come from post Brexit and things like that? So I'd quite like to see how this would be reflected in some analysis of the labour market, if you like, and what that would mean. And just while I'm here, I might want to come back again. I think that there is an issue about, well, how many people will take this up?
Yeah.
Because if you're saying that everyone can have, there is a free shelter for everybody, by which I presume you mean not you can go into a shelter, but you can have a home. And I can imagine thinking back to the days of rent control, when, for example, students coming out of university would want and expect to be able to go into cheap housing. And is it for them as well, or is it for the families that you're really thinking about? Because it could become quite the thing to want free housing. Why not? But how would that affect your analysis, your economic analysis? There are lots of questions in there, but really, can I just say one thing more? But the New Economics Foundation is struggling with this issue about what you do and how you can try to rethink the welfare state for the current day. We've been taking an interest in the idea of the commons. Now, it's very similar to, it's the essential resources you need to meet basic human needs, okay? And it includes land, air and water, but it also could be thought to include things like food and shelter and transport.
Yeah.
But instead of thinking about, because there's a different skill set there, about how it might work out in quantitative terms, we're thinking about how you make decisions, how people can claim and control these resources, what that would mean. And this is an idea that's been out there in the kind of sort of ideas sphere for ages, but what if you brought that into public policy, and instead of it just being a thing that was provided by government with the local dimension, it was something that people were claiming and controlling themselves. So really designing in a very strong democratic element, I think, would be what that's about.
Yeah.
So,
I agree.
thank
I mean,
you.
the issue of democratic deficit is also very much embedded in our thinking, but we haven't gone through all of that process. And similarly, the number of jobs created in the economy and the overall impact on that is our next. So maybe we could team up with the Economics Foundation. So just behind
Yeah,
that.
but any initial comments on the labour market effect on
Well, we haven't really.
Yeah.
The one constraint of this is that we didn't really look at the labour market impact because we had enough on our plate trying to work out the distribution impact is without labour market impact. But that is something we would like to go on and do in the
that's
future
our
because
next-
it may well be. I think it's likely to be very important. Likewise on take up. I mean, what we on shelter in particular, we've kind of just assumed that new social housing units are constructed to deal with the current kind of deficit in supply, really, and current sort of unmet need. Now, it may well be that over time you would need to budget for an extension of that, so it takes over more of the existing social housing sector, becomes this kind of rent-free accommodation. And again, that's something I'd like to do in the future, is do more of a kind of a more medium-term costing for a transition path that kind of expands. Takes account of some of these basic services expanding.
And on the labour market, I think that you can do some quantitative modelling, but fundamentally the rationale for proposals like this is to transform the sort of set of incentives and opportunities that people have in the labour market. As I said, in my introduction, at the moment the UK economy is astonishingly good, despite robots and automation, at generating jobs, but it's clear that too high a proportion of these jobs are not just low skill, but offer little prospect for skill or career development, at the same time as being quite insecure, and they are low quality jobs in general sense. So a key motivation for this is to sort of shift the balance of power in the labour market and shift people's opportunity set. In two ways. I think one is that to allow people to develop themselves from a sort of classic human capital economic point of view, that is training, skill acquisition, so they can do higher productivity, higher paid jobs, which is a positive outcome. The other is that so that people have the opportunity to do things which may or may not translate directly into higher pay, but have either higher personal or intrinsic value or higher social value, whether that's caring jobs or simply pursuing more creative or self-development things. Now, how you actually, I think, frankly, sort of quantitative modelling of this sort of thing is quite difficult, but modelling, what you can do is sort of set out how you do change their sort of opportunity set, and I think that also ties into the sort of set of services you're looking at, both transport and information and communication, ICT services, are things which you actually need in order to be able to expand your opportunities set, right? You can't develop you can't really participate in the modern UK economy if you don't have a smartphone. Right?
But there are two effects, aren't there? I mean, it does something to people's ability to get jobs, but it also must create
Yeah.
a very
that's
large
right.
number
That's
of jobs which
Yeah.
may be
It is
less
about-
skilled, but are, we've got to provide these services. If you think about the welfare
Yeah.
state being the biggest, such a
Yeah.
very big employer already, this would make it fast, would it not?
So let me
It's really important to get, we've got lots of questions, it's really important to get this debate going, because as the debate takes shape, these dynamic pathways and transition will begin to emerge and will be critiqued and refined. And I think that's a really important part. Anyway, you had a question immediately behind you, and then David, and then one here, and then one here, so we're doing well on this. So,
I'm Anne Perkins from The Guardian, and I'm not an expert in any kind in anything like this. I think I'm here to be the centrist dad figure.
Oh, wait.
And say, this is lovely, what a fantastic idea, but how the hell would you make it work? Anyway, thinking about it,
Yeah.
I think the previous two commenters who've drawn attention to the importance of democratic engagement and also to localism. I mean, that seems to me that if you were to try and get this debate out of academic and theoretical circles onto the ground, it's got to be done through the cities and the towns. And I mean, I'm sure all of us know how very hard it is to engage and change direction, and it just seems to me that when you kind of think of it like this as a kind of big bang, and that you explode into a world where most voters appear to be quite chilled with the attack on the welfare state. You've got a huge argument to make that's going to need some kind of practical on the ground evidence to make it all up.
Yes, I know. Well, one of the things that we're thinking of doing in the very near future is engaging all the newly elected mayors in this, because that's, I think, an interesting discussion. There's certain people who may not have all the powers they think they have, but nevertheless interesting. David, you're next.
Yeah, thank you. It's very exciting, but also there seem to me quite a lot of dangers. I mean, it's exciting because there's been a lot of attention given to universal basic income and far less to ways of actually ensuring everyone has, in some sense, an adequate money income, including reforms of social security and support for people in work. It's presented as sort of the answer to that, which I seriously doubt. But emphasising the service side seems to have been seriously neglected. But having said that, there's a lot of things that, if you like, are the interface of income and services, and that's where saying, well, you'll have 1.5 million more units of housing, which a lot of people would think that was highly desirable, and that 5,000 proposed by the Prime Minister is rather small beer compared with that need. But saying that they will be provided rent-free is creating a service for those in need, certainly, but quite separate from the whole housing market, and that seems to me to create huge problems. That if you say, well, there's a sort of feeding service for the poor, most poor people buy their food, and many are extremely hard pressed, and many can't afford enough. But how you change that, how you alter that, and also alter people's knowledge about what food is going to do them any good, which, if you read Guardian headlines about costs of obesity, is not an insignificant problem. So most food's going to be, there's huge scope for extending breakfasts at schools and school meals, but so looking at the interface of if you like, food and education, but income is also part of that, and income is going to purchase for most people their housing, And so I think trying to sort of link the proposals about services with how that relates to income is very important. You can't just put them in two separate boxes and say, sort of, here at IGP we're for services and other people elsewhere will say we're for income. I mean, one of the biggest dangers of some UBI supporters is that American neocons who want to do away with education, want to do away with health services, they just want to say give them income, or a little income, and wash your hands of it. That seems appalling proposal to me. But looking at that income in relation to services seems to be something that you have to do. Otherwise, the whole shelter element is just shelter for the poor, and it will soon become sort of hostels for the poor and better management of food banks rather than ensuring that people have income sufficient to buy a decent diet.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that this has to be a two-pronged attack, doesn't it? I mean, in the report we do model this question of, what could be an additional support from UBI to UBS as a way of just addressing one or two of those issues. But the general point you make is a good one. The difficulty is that, in a situation where increasing decent work is increasingly becoming problematic for bottom 20% of the population. So consequently, you can be in work, but you can still be part of a working poor. So the social wage thing becomes a very important element of that. But how you deal with these issues about segregation, equity, I think, is where the big discussion comes. And I think, Howard, do you want to come back on that before I take on the question?
No, I think that's basically.
Yeah.
Just in one point about the report. I mean, we were actually we're alive to this, I think, in two aspects. One is that we've not fiddled with the benefit system as part of the rationale for services. When we look at the basic income component, and there is a small one in there that's a cash component, then we did look at that in terms of its equivalence to replacing child benefit or deduction from other benefits, because it's a cash distribution. And perhaps more generally, this is lovely, because exactly what we thought would happen is we take this idea to this point. There's a lot of avenues that need to be explored in more detail and better understood. And so this first step is, we hope, will encourage, we'd love to work with anyone on further exploration of any of these portions, the environmental impact, the labour market impacts, how exactly would you do the housing thing. These are all exciting opportunities.
So I've got loads of overlapping thoughts. Andrew Harrop from Bailey's Society. I firstly want to pick up on what David said about, is this just services for the poor? And I think that even if something is notionally universalist, if it is intended to be for what was some of saying only the bottom decile, I think you create all the issues of stigma and declining quality over time. And whether that's sort of self-policing, because only a certain category of people will feel that, things, that the cards they've been dealt mean that they need to use that service. Or I think in the housing side, you're going to have massive supply constraint, aren't you? So, I think we'd all like free housing if it was of adequate quality that met our needs, but that's clearly nothing like what you've costed. And as a thought experiment, why don't we just get rid of rents for all social housing? That is the sort of scale of
an option we consider.
But it's an incredibly expensive option, isn't it? So it does feel that you've got two very targeted pro-poor, but inevitably sort of rationed in one way or another offers. And then you've got your transport and your information services, which is an argument about universal utilities. And they sort of feel like qualitatively quite different debates that you're sort of kicking off, and I think what was most interesting about this report, I think, is that you're pushing the boundaries, and it sort of, for me, this feels like a provocative thought experiment that is pushing us to think differently about universal services, it may be that in practice what we end up with is trying to think about sort of the boundaries of universalism shifting outwards in various directions, but not necessarily a radical new endpoint. So, if we go back to human rights, think about social and economic rights being facilitated by the state, sometimes the answer is a universal offer, but sometimes it is the obligation of the state to ensure that everyone has provisions, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's couched in sort of an offer that literally every citizen can access. And so a final thought is, it's interesting that you've not gone to all the areas which are very near current provisions. So, you haven't got social care, you haven't got childcare, you haven't got lifelong learning, you haven't got legal aid, which you sort of touched on right at the start. But those seem to me, they're near enough existing universal provision to be expandable rather than whole new pillars.
Yeah, it's a good point, but it is about starting somewhere with the debate, right? And it also changing the focus of what this is about, because much of this debate is couched in very simple terms in the media and in the public mind, which is whatever it is you're proposing, we can't afford it. That's the basic story. We can't afford it. Actually, we can, right? I mean, so this starts a different kind of conversation, which is really about, if you can afford it, then what are your priorities, right? I mean, how does that get reshaped? So what exactly, as Anna said, what is the welfare state for the 21st century, and what shape does it get? You can call it anything we like, but if we focus instead on quality of people's lives and what drives improvement in the quality of people's lives, which includes decent work, so not this bone-breaking work that you do for hours and hours and hours that pays nothing, then I think we have to move away from, if you start from within the set of the benefits as they exist and within the tax structures and so on and so forth, you very quickly find yourself caught up in this discussion which has been going round and round and round for a very long time. This proposal is intended, I think, to open up a space for discussion, including a space for public discussion, so not just amongst us, but amongst members of the public, which is what should the government, or could and would the government do for us? And actually, this is a very big ask, that space. And there's been very, very poor ideas. I mean, very, very, very few ideas.